Perspectives.
Perspective. Nuanced perspective.
My perspectives are always shitty and
Everybody, that's
biased. Well,
we're all biased. I mean, there's no other possible place from which to judge anything other than our own finite contingency. So
we have that additional thing though, where one of my mantras was to break out of groupthink, noticing what it is, break out of it, get out of your bubbles, be surrounded by different influences. And my effort to break out of groupthink locked me in to a bubble of influences.
Yeah. But that's because just as an animal that is a social animal, we are inevitably trapped in groupthink. Just as an animal that mediates its reality through language, and language only works as a shared medium, we are inevitably stuck.
They argue to be 20% of communications.
Yeah,
losing it all.
And so, you can't escape that question. And frankly, as an animal, we can't survive outside of a social environment, right? Like you put somebody in solitary, they go nuts. And so for us, existence is intimately tied to living alongside one another. Like there is no other way for us to be in the world.
And that goes back to that thing where I said we keep making these rules that prevent us from that. Like we talk about communes jokingly and we tease them, but who the fuck is on the actual things that work? Like it does take a village to raise a child, and you're going to get superior products of life raised in an intricate community like that. But if 70 hippies go start opening up some peace, love, and humanity commune, we look at them like they're idiots.
I mean, so I guess Richard Rorty, the prominent, American pragmatist philosopher, talked about the fact.
No, I don't know. And neither does anyone else listening to this.
That's all right. That's all right. We're nerding out right now. He talked about the fact that, because we are confined by language and vocabulary, and because inevitably truth is a function of statements, right? There's no realm outside of statements and discourse in which the question of truth even enters. The key is not to sort of achieve a vocabulary so expansive that it encompasses necessarily every human experience, right? There's no sort of vantage point outside of our own finite experience that we can stand from to try to even determine what the boundaries of a project like that would look like. So the key is not to sort of find some sort of universal set of values, which has been, I think, the traditional Western philosophical project. Let's find that sort of universal objective value that sort of sets everything in the right order. But simply to engage as many vocabularies as we possibly can, right? And this is why I use hip hop to frame a lot of the work I do that is intended to document social conditions. Because hip-hop has been the language of inner-city poverty in America for 3 or 4 decades now. And so hip-hop provides us a vocabulary, a language, to describe and mediate that reality, even if we ourselves are not living it. And so because of that, I try to use it to show, like, this is an entry point into a set of values and into a set of experiences, because all language is a result and function of the experiences we have collectively shared. It is an entry point into a perspective you might not have, but that you can intimately, through the use of language, come into contact with.
Yeah, that is, I don't know. Like you said, you're nerding out on us again, and you're making these points that just seem like they seem obvious when you start to break them down and analyze what they are. And those mediums seem to be relatively underappreciated because of those biases we have in our society. And what's really kind of bringing that out to me is with Bob Dylan getting the
literature Nobel,
that's a door opening that has to eventually acknowledge the hip hop artists that were telling these messages decades ago and getting that social consciousness started in that format.
So who'll be the first hip hop artist to win the Nobel Prize in literature?
We can certainly ask you better than me on that, but the only things I remember is like cannabis, NWA.
I don't think it's gonna be cannabis.
I listen to NWA, Onyx.
I don't think it'll be. It's a slightly biased answer, but I think the right choice would be Nas. If you were to say like who.
But you also got to break this in a poetry form. So
Sure.
does it fit that? Because that's the thing about Dylan that really stood out to me. I'm not a big Bob Dylan music fan, but when you do read his lyrics as a standalone, you're like, oh, that's clearly poetry.
Yeah, well, I don't. I think really it's not so much a question of poetry, but poesy, right? The ability to use words in a way that challenges our basic understanding, not only of those terms, but also of the structure of language, to show that despite their sort of surface level promise to mediate a reality untouched, that is not what vocabulary does. That is not what words do, right? Words are a tool we use, and we can use it in any number of ways, right? And, sort of not great example of this is the F word, right? Like it can just be
Greatest
used in
word there
so
is.
many ways. But it's a sort of so like
Think about it. These fucking fucks fuck that up.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
actually said something.
But it's a perfect example. But what I think hip hop in a lot of ways does is that it uses that ars technica of poesy to challenge the way that we think language functions. And I don't know of a rapper that has contributed more to challenging our interpretation of the social conditions that exist in a place like the Queensbridge Projects and all their cognates throughout the world than Nas. That's my personal.
I think that's my homework
Case.
assignment then is to do a little homework and see how I feel about that, considering I wasn't somebody conscious back then or into any conscious rap or would have picked up on the significance of lyrics like you do now. Like, I mean, even NWA, like in this, especially in the context right now, is like those are prophetic words that people should have been paying attention to back then.
Yeah, I mean, just think about what our social reality and commitment to the idea of police was in the 80s. And then for them to put that song out, they fundamentally challenged the idea that when we hear police, that we should assume something good. Now, it took time for that to sort of wend its way beyond, one corner of the hip hop community. But that is a perfect example of where this art form and this group in particular has taken a word and forced us to rethink what the capacity of language is fundamentally.
Yeah, and I think especially looking at the progression from the times they said that, a lot more people can say, yeah, fuck the police. Right? Because, and it's not fuck that police officer either. It's fuck the police. That's the institution. That's not that individual that's carrying it out. They are specifically saying this institution oppresses us and creates problems, and we have those problems on our doorstep, and that has to be recognize and appreciate it to some effect, where that must be the case now with some of these current lyricists who are putting out fresh material, that they're obviously saying things that 30 years from now you're going to go, like, oh shit, we should have listened. And that harps back to this community board issue of, can we trust these people? Yes, we can trust these people. Dr. Dre was articulating something as an 18-year-old child, or it was close to that a vast majority of America can't conceptualize, which is what a lot of activists here in Baltimore did for me. Kwame, Devin, Adam Jackson, a lot of these people ended up saying things and giving me perspectives that I just couldn't take in and understand without their ability to articulate something I didn't get. White liberal was something I did not get until Kwame beat it down into my brain to figure out that the white liberal is the enemy, and I see it now.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because, like, I remember when the Michelle Alexander book first came out, and it was never something that at the time I felt particularly compelled to read, because I read the title, The New Jim Crow, and, like the little subtitle, I was like, I knew exactly what that book said, right? Just because I was like a Puerto Rican guy who grew up in the Northeast listening to hip hop my whole life. Like, I've already read this book a million times. I don't need to read it to know exactly what it says. And my main reaction was like, oh, that's like a good way to describe it, the new Jim Crow, and like moved on because, just from my social location, this wasn't something that like you had to convince me of. Like,
I never read it either.
Yeah, gotcha. I was like, yeah, I mean, we've been saying that forever, right? Like, in certain communities. But, I mean, that was a perfect example, going back to the fuck the police thing. We went from police to not the individual officer to the institution. Like, look what their use of that single word in that phrase forced us to do intellectually, right? To sort of break down what do we even mean when we say police, right? And I think that is the power, and that's not obviously exclusive to hip hop, but that is the power of poesy, right? And I think that's where it is in Dylan, and it is in Nas, and it is in a million other artists. And that is the value of art, I think, oftentimes. And look, obviously there's some art that isn't high art in this way, right? Sometimes it's just a song for the party. And that's okay, because we all like to party too. It's okay for like, somebody to make a shitty club song, because that's what I want to hear when I'm at the club. But when, I want to put on an Illmatic or, and then you shoot your cousin by the Roots or an Undone, when I'm in a different type of space. And the capacity for hip hop to expand our understanding of our own language, but also to give us an entryway into a reality many of us would not otherwise touch is powerful. And the Wu-Tang has this line in one of their songs, off the Jizza Liquid Swords album, if you're living in the world today, then you're familiar with the slang that the Wu-Tang say. And that idea of slang, I think, is really an important one, because when I moved to England, there are certain slang words that they use, like they referred to the British like money as a quid. And the first time you hear it, you know exactly what they mean, right? The first time somebody walked up and was like, oh man, that thing got knackered, I knew exactly what they meant, right? I had never heard this word said to me before, but it was immediately, because it was language, and because all language is contextual, it was immediately clear what that meant. And so when we engage in alternative vocabulary, one that we wouldn't normally employ, what it does is it gives us an entryway into the context that created it. And we can simply observe that context, or we can decide we need to intervene in that context. But if we are paying attention, we should not be able to ignore that context.
Paying attention being the key word, because what I was just running through my mind is the willful ignorance of, I hate to say white America, but when I say white America all the time, I think people should understand what I mean. I mean ignorant, privileged, white people going around saying, oh, we're in the greatest country in the world, which is like an empirical fact that it is not the greatest country in the world. It's not number one at anything other than incarceration, GDP, and there's military. So we're great at killing people, making shit, and putting people in jail. Wonderful. Everything else, somebody's better than us at.
I mean, look, you got to have some trophies on the shelf, right?
Right, we got some. So what I'm thinking is how that white America ignores the context of that, because they maybe don't want to understand it, because you see things like they talk about music and hip hop and that culture, and at the same time they're listening to Jailhouse Rock being sung by the hell's his name, Elvis
Presley, yeah.
and Jailhouse Rock is about banging a little weak young man and raping him in jail. That is the Jailhouse Rock, is a big felony criminal finding the sweetest little young boy who enters into the prison so he can rape him, and you're going to tell NWA that fuck the police is bad?
But I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there's a reason that white America particularly, had the reaction it did to rock and roll, right? I mean, rock and roll, hip hop is rock and roll after rock and roll became old and boring.
Yeah, it's Marilyn. Like the idea that they think about how they demonized Marilyn Manson.
Yeah.
And it's like, for what? The first thing I need you to recognize is you didn't listen to any of his lyrics, because he's not saying anything you actually have a problem with.
Yeah.
You don't like the makeup and the way he presented himself, and you let all those biases flooded for a dude that's a good musician and writes lyrics that are relevant to how people feel.
No, absolutely. But going back to whether we have ignored hip hop, I think part of the problem is that we don't think of it as language, as vocabulary, and also that we just, because our experience of language is one where we are sort of involved in it innately, just as an animal. We don't have to think about what language is, right? And certainly our public education is not like...
We don't, but maybe we should.
But that's the thing. If we did, we could, I wouldn't have spent, I fell in love with hip hop officially in 1993, Hip Hop Parade. That was the song that made me a hip hop fan for life. But I have to admit that it was really when I moved to Hartford, Connecticut at 22 years old, where that was my real first time experiencing what inner city poverty looked like. And admittedly, at that age, it struck me so much because that's a city that has a very large Puerto Rican population. So these are my people who are suffering, this experience. But there's no reason that I should have spent all those years in between listening to a music like hip hop. And even though I was a liberal, right, the white liberal, in many ways, especially because, I grew up in a place like Amherst, Massachusetts. While I, maybe intellectually I would say the right thing in terms of I'm on this side of the issue versus that, I had no idea what poverty actually was. And when I listen to those records today, especially after all the work I've done in a place like Baltimore, I'm like, this is describing this place perfectly, but 20 years ago. And that's where I fault myself in a lot of ways, because for 20 years, that means I ignored something that was in my face. Like I went out of my way to put something into my ear so I could listen to this guy describe this reality. And then I was like, yo, this beat is banging, man. And look, we're all fine that we all have our limitations. But what I hope that some of my work does is it helps people realize that this thing that I'm just like rocking to in the club is actually describing a horrifying reality that demands an intervention.
It's so funny how like things shape us as adults now, that I'm thinking about looking at you in that perspective, and how so many people would perceive us as being very similar. Like especially from the outside, education levels and appearance, just in general, we could probably be mistaken for brothers.
No, definitely, it wouldn't be a stretch.
So that gets these ideas about what has formulated us and even how we got here. So detractors are going to think that we followed some kind of similar path, and we're on completely different paths. I remember my musical like awakening coming from two particular songs. In two different ways that attracted me to heavy metal.
Okay.
And that's been my musical formulation. But they also were talking about these very same type of things that I fucking ignored. So the first one that I remember specifically was music videos. And I watched Metallica play and Justice for All.
Okay.
And I was like, fuck. Rock and roll.
Yeah.
Shit. Like I wanted to headbang. I was like, man. But that song is talking about the evils of war and how we neglect our veterans and we don't treat people the way we would, and we'll send the poor over to war and die, and we just carry on about life, and so this is justice for all. And but that message isn't what I heard. I heard Lars double drum doing that awesome ending, and darkness imprisoning them in this solitary, like there's so many ways you can view that. And then I specifically remember in middle school when a friend handed me a cassette tape, and I opened it. It had a man in the middle of Tiananmen Square burning, and I put that in, and I heard Bomb Track and Zach De La Rocha's The Music of Rage brought me in, but I started to listen to Zach and all those messages that we're getting through about how we're lied to by the government, we're manipulated, the police will beat you down, and they're just a wing of an oligarchy with money. I mean, I want people right now to go back and listen to some songs by Rage Against the Machine, or listen to the video. I don't know why I can't remember what song it is, but the one is talking about money and politics and how Gore and Bush are really the exact same person, because when it comes down to it, all they're going to do is serve corporate donors. And these are the things he was talking about in the early 90s. And this is what we're talking about trying to get presidential candidates to do. So you talk about earlier saying, when does our influence come in? So Zach could be thinking I wrote all these lyrics for no goddamn reason. reason.
Yeah.
And he doesn't realize that set the trend of shaping my life, which developed a model, which a millennial 10 years from now may be the one that actually carries out and gets the thing for. But we saw all this as failure.
Exactly.
And it was the path.
I mean, it goes back to the last episode in the optimism conversation, and that's why it's kind of like, the reason why it's not worth losing hope is because you're too contingent to know what your impact even is, right? Like, you could literally die in the gutter and that be the thing that like sparked an idea to somebody else that like launched some new era of human civilization.
There was no way that Tamir Rice was sitting on that playground, fucking around, thinking 5 minutes from now, I will become the primary motivation for why Mike Wood says fuck the police as well and tries to fix the situation. There's no way that boy thought of that at that time, but that is what is immortalized as.
No, absolutely. And, and that's an impact. I mean, obviously that's a tragedy, so it's not like, but that's exactly it, right? And the truth is we're all here and we're all gone in a blink of an eye. And that's not to minimize, obviously, what happened. But it's just to say that we do have to sort of have an awareness that we don't know. Like, I mean, even who knew that when we started interacting that we'd be sitting here today, right? But, going back to that question of music and the way it informs us, my favorite example of this is when like Republicans play Born in the USA at their rallies.
They obviously didn't listen to the lyrics.
They have not listened to that song because they just love the hook, right? It's got the hot hook. It's a hot beat and a hot hook.
And that's as far as anyone's going to go. So they'll play Born in the USA, Jailhouse Rock, and then they're going to talk about how evil Marilyn Manson and NWA are. And you're like, wait, what?
Wait, you just played like their forebears.
And then talk shit about Kaepernick.
Yeah, exactly. Right. This has been another episode of Nuance. Join us next week.
Tweet and talk shit about Kaepernick.
What we give Nas his Nobel Literature Prize.